Don't want to poke who, Al?
Um...
don't want to annoy whom? Whom don't you want to annoy?
You. And
That's a good idea. Because right now I'll just sneeze on you like one of those dinosaurs, and my poisonous snot will
like the Pope,
like
with his ruff.
Yeah,
that blinds
Queen Mombi.
Newman. Yeah.
The heads that detach on the swiveling axis of my Elizabethan collar,
and then juggle them like those guys from Labyrinth.
Yeah, so
our theme tune is pretty abstract this time. We've gone for halfway through a conversation in G minor, but we hope you like it. And welcome to Radio Free Golgotha and the first podcast transmission of the new year. Hello, hope you're well, everyone. If you're not, I hope you're getting better.
I am sick. I apologize. Hopefully Al doesn't get re-sick from this, because I'm pretty sure he's the one that gave it to me.
Yeah, I made
that and the lovely airplane air.
Yeah, good old airplane air.
But Happy New Year. Welcome to 2018.
Yay!
What are we going to talk about, Al?
So the plan was to talk about Saint Agnes. Now, we record this at the moment on a secret day from our secret base location, Spider Skull Island style. With our decommissioned death ray turned into a positronic what's name. We wanted to record this about the Feast of Saint Agnes, and so we're going to go ahead with that, despite the fact that the main feast day was yesterday. However, we are in luck in that pre-Vatican II, as Jessie just informed me earlier, feast day is actually the 28th.
Not just actually, she had two. She was like a redundant saint feast thing. So lady had like two feasts, and I think, maybe a memory of longer feast celebrations. But
this is part of that thing that you get with the summer rain period saints, right? Is either you'll get several saints bunched together, and if the weather is bad on that one week, they won't do so much with that saint because they know they've got someone else in a week's time that they can make more of an effort with and can kind of grandfather in the previous saint.
I want purple rain saints.
Yeah?
Yeah. A little prince in my life. So the pre-Vatican II, there was two feasts, the 21st and the 28th, and post-Vatican II, they decided to chop off the second one and
consolidate all their existing saints into one.
Put it towards the 21st. And I think there's some speculation on that, but that her mysteries might influence such a decision, but I think a lot of those justifications are happening from people afterwards,
right?
Making mystical noodles out of Catholic editing choices.
Yeah. So the plan is to talk Agnes and Agnesian mysteries. It's also to talk about Rosemary, if we're talking about cleansing things. We thought that was pretty cool. To talk about amber. To talk about the Geomantic Figure Populus and the Odú Ejioko. And also possibly get to some protection magic and the tarot card of strength, and also potentially our demon of the week, Sagathana, and their Eshu of the week counterparted, Seu Veludo. So that was our plan for the episode. As always, we may not get to all of them, but those that we don't will be carried over to potentially pop up somewhere else. We were trying to think if there were any headers, exciting things that we wanted to say at the start before we dived in.
No, we've had a couple of the missing episodes be put up, and it looks like we'll continue in that vein. We have a nice kind of mini episode that explains the podcast, and hopefully we can record part 2 of that soon. We both have courses and classes going on, which could be current if you're hearing this close to the broadcast, but we seem to always have classes and courses going on.
We updated the talks part of the Radio Free Golgotha website, which looks lovely, and we encourage you to come and have a look at our things.
We have a Facebook group that's getting and stirring a lot of conversation that is called Folk Necromancy, and it is an extension of Radio Free Golgotha. It was originally capitalizing on the I do credit Al with inventing the term folk necromancy as a TM. I like that it seems to have found its way into many people's vocabularies as a term that has always been there. But if you look carefully, it was not. And not that I wish you could collect royalty checks, but it's great that we're just discussing necromancy outside of books of art and understanding necromancy and nigromancy on a larger context, which fits into our explorations on the publishing, writing end, and as well as podcasting.
Yeah, exactly. It was part of the reason we called the imprint or the series that we're doing through Revelor Press, Folk Necromancy and Transmission, where we're very happy with that. And I might end up banging on about the announcement I made for my new little chapbook on the Three Kings, on the Magi, which is slated to be released on the third day of the third month, because we figured as many threes as we could get would be good. So I might talk about that, or it might just be a thing that I mentioned now and encourage you to go and look at. But I think mainly just, thanks for tuning in. Great to be back doing this. And
hopefully less repeats between this episode and one of the missing episodes this time.
Right.
It's funny when you don't publish things, you forget what you talked about. It could be interesting too, for you to go back and for us to do a kind of follow-up to the first episode, and you talk about the book a little bit and see where it goes, but kind of a follow-up to the Three Kings.
Yeah, I do like that was our first one. I feel like that put us on a steady foot forward. So that said, speaking of feet forward,
hairy feet?
Yeah. Proud foot.
Hobbit foot. Saint Agnes was a hobbit.
Canonically,
you heard it here first.
Hobbit. Yeah, absolutely. So, what are the things about Agnes that we first get to? Oh, we can be golden legend style.
You can be golden dawn.
No,
go ahead.
No, I'd rather not. We can start with some, shall we say, folk etymology, or at least, picking apart the name, which is a very common way that this medieval hagiography begins a saint. So, Agnes as what are the two words? We've got lamb and chaste.
Well, Agnus is lamb, and she is often depicted with a lamb, and this seems to be very much a play on the fact that in many dialects of spoken Latin, it's going to be sounding very similar for people who don't speak the language all the time.
Yeah.
So Agnes becomes Agnus, and especially in writing, so a vowel change changes it. But you're dealing with a Greek word, Agnes, for chaste, or pure, and this becomes, it's hard to tell, like many early saints, what the historicity of this is, but she is a saint that is early enough and venerated enough by the 4th century that it is impossible to erase her from the canon. And she is one of the few female saints that are listed in the Litany of the Saints at the start of a full 6-candle mass. So it's
one of 7, right?
Yes. Is it 7?
I think so.
Including the Virgin Mary? But the other side of it, following up on our talk of Lucy, that she was an inspiration to other early saints.
Yeah.
And so this 12 or 13-year-old girl who fends off Christian suitors.
And specifically suitors who keep coming back with more wealth. That's the main emphasis. There isn't the initial emphasis you get in, say, Justina's stories about a guy who's interested in her and tries to buy her from her parents, and then gets handsy, or then gets violent, or then calls a love sorcerer to come and put a whammy on her. So much as he comes back with more and more wealth, and the emphasis is placed on the greater jewels that her first husband has given her, and that's consistently how she supposedly frames her relationship with Christ. In the Golden Legend, at least, is as being married to Jeebus. Yeah,
and I find it beautiful. It's like you have she's 12 or 13, which is the start of womanhood within Judaic adulthood. There, and traditionally one of the ages ascribed to the Virgin Mary when she becomes pregnant. So. I think the ages we were told in the CCD was that Mary was like 12 or 13 and Joseph was 86 specifically, which explains why he dies early on in the story and you don't hear from him anymore. But that a 12 or 13-year-old girl fends off the advancements and then is reported, she's tattled on by her suitors for being a Christian because she's refuting wealthy suitors.
And she won't make sacrifice to the pagan gods as well, as another standard feature of many of these stories.
And so she is dragged through the streets to a brothel, I believe.
A bordel, as it's phrased in medieval type.
So to a brothel, and is that when she sprouts the hobbit hairs?
I think that might be a little bit before, or it might be during. Certainly, she's stripped naked at some point.
Yes, she's stripped. I think she's dragged through the streets naked in many accounts. It varies on which version and which placement of these things are, but the older accounts, I believe, she's stripped naked, dragged through the streets to a brothel in an attempt to defile her.
Right.
But she grows hair all over her body.
Or hair from her head all the way down.
Yeah, or hair from the head all the way down. So you have hairy saint, which also some people have taken as the signal of puberty. That she fully comes into hairy womanhood. But there are some other interpretations that I find interesting, is that she grows hair like a man. So I know that there are some folk interpretations that she suddenly grows a beard to show that her ability to assert her own identity is equal to a man, that she defines who she is, which is interesting because she's one of the earliest notable female martyrs who is named and has a cult around her. But this idea of growing hair either all over the body or from the face or from the head that goes down likens her to Mary Magdalene, likens her to later of Mary of Egypt, who we've talked about.
That concept of linking it to the BVM and that idea of the hairy stars.
It's the Blessed Virgin Mary for the non-Catholics or the non-acronymics, something.
The idea of hairy stars being like one of the word for comets, and the idea of hair being like beautiful. Light as well, which is another link back to her eventual patronage of Saint Lucy that we discussed in that episode. That she is the one that turns up and tells Lucy, "You got this, girl. You can saint on your own."
Did you ever call her Mary with the Cherry growing up?
No.
That's totally a CCD thing. Yeah, Mary with the Cherry, BBM.
Oh, with the cherry.
Yeah.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
The cherry of her chastity. The hymen is apparently a cherry or cherry flavored. I don't know. That's not my department. I'll interview on that later. The astounding thing also, in addition to the hair growth, is that the people who come to molest, rape, and physically assault her are blinded. That the hairy growth and these other things, there is interpretation that, like you just talked about with stars of hairy comets, that I think in one, there's a carol that I believe is either Occitan or Catalonian, to find it, that refers to her as being a definite descendant of Noah, who as a baby blinded, the blinding his own son through seeing them naked, but like as a baby was also glowing and considered horned according to one account. So horns and hair being parallels for emitting light, and this pure light there too. So the chaste flame or what this is. So it's a marker of her divinity, of her marriage to God, just as Moses' marriage results in his own horns or these other things going on. So that comparing her to Noah and the ability to blind those who would try and abuse her is quite interesting.
And she's not just called, a filthy Christian by these, heathen sources. She's explicitly called a witch and an enchantress because these people are blinded, which is, very interesting in terms of looking at the, taking forward that notion that Peter French and other people have put forward about querying that saintness. The cult of the saints is some kind of natural extension of ancestor hero worship by pagans, and it would have looked very similar, where it's another one of those ways in which it seems early Christian stuff is actually looked at a lot more uncomfortably in terms of mucking about with bodies and things like that.
Yeah, we've they've talked about this in a few of our in-person talks too, of just the cult of saints is a cult of the restless dead by classical necromantic terms. To not bury a saint and to divide its body apart and then demand miracles of it is kind of pretty badass witchery in the old school Eastern Mediterranean.
Deliberately designing it to be restless.
Yeah, and therefore leaves open for the possibility of any relic that is named, it's going to perform the miracle because it's being tortured. Mm-hmm. So there's the thing of, I'll give you this new home and give you all these offerings and have the sacrifice of the Mass for your eternal rest. Mm-hmm. Doesn't matter that you're not actually Agnes.
Right.
Although Agnes's skull is in Rome, mm-hmm. and there's quite a few churches dedicated to her, but one that is over the place of the catacomb where she was buried, and another where her skull is kept separate. And it's a very, very clean skull for being 2,000 years old.
Oh, yeah?
You can see Wikipedia has a good picture of it. Primary source now, Wikipedia. The other side of it with Agnes that I find interesting is it's an early discussion or portrayal of relics, in that the blood that is spilled on I think it's the stadium floor where she is finally beheaded / stabbed in the throat, very similar to Lucy, who dies by her own and similar means.
The phrase is something like he orders, what is it, Aspasius orders that a sword be put in her body, which I don't know if that's a translation from the Latin to sound that odd. But there's something about that. Well,
it's very phallic penetration, right. Like finally, we have pierced her. Mm-hmm. But that the blood, which is the actual piercing of the body, is mirrored to the hymen in the first blood of the Droita Senor type of attitude, that Christians mopped up her blood on pieces of cloth and saved it to honor it. And there is not just her bones that were honored, but various shrouds of Agnes that were also relics. And supposedly there are French and Spanish customs of the shrouds being passed down in families, and or the shroud, when it would disintegrate, that the youngest girl would eat the ashes and then would prick herself, and her blood would have Agnes's essence and grace in it to keep it going.
That's fascinating.
So there was this preservation of Agnes, and again tying it to the lamb, because Agnes is often depicted with a lamb, even though martyrs aren't traditionally just lambs. That's Jesus in her arms on some level, but that Agnes and Agnus are inextricably linked, and that she doesn't just have the palms of martyrdom or the lily of martyrdom, that she is actually tied to the slaughter of the lamb, and that she is a fitting bride for Christ, that she literally carries Jesus in her arms, but not as a human, because frankly, babies in your arms as your husband is creepy, right? But that, which there was actually a really good viral video going around on the Liber AF that was describing the art history context of why Jesus looks like a little creepy old man, and it's the belief in the homunculus, that Jesus was for a while. The doctrine basically said that he was fully divine and fully human from the beginning, and therefore was a little man that grew up to be a big man. And so as a child, he looked like an old man and grew into it.
Right.
Which you don't want to depict him as a baby, because he didn't have the same infantile things. He didn't, shit his green diarrhea all over himself.
Right. He's
he leaves that for those of us that have the flu.
Yeah. And judging you.
Yeah, judging. Judgy Jesus.
There are instances with talking about permutations of her name where it looks like she gets drafted into grimoire litanies, which look like they're talking about "and all the angels," and a couple of typos turn it into the Agneses, and it becomes Agnes. Joseph H. Peterson has pointed out a couple of those, specifically in the Anilos formula, if you like, or the names of 3 of the angels that turn up in certain scrying operations, and specifically certain modular scrying operations that you call these 3 angels that stand on the right when you're doing this scrying, and then once they've turned up you can do other exercises as well. Operations, I suppose, the idea of modular operations. But yeah, she's specifically linked to those 3, and it's likely that word, which might not even be angels, becomes angels, and then from there, through copying and bizarre handwriting and things like that, eventually becomes Agnes. So she gets inserted back in via another permutation of her name.
That's interesting. Excuse me. She also has the very witchy thing of they attempted to burn her at the stake, but the post would not light, and this is why they ordered the execution by sticking a sword in her. But again, tying to a big stick, and the flyer doesn't go. Infertility, eventually varying into fertility, and lambs themselves being associated with fertility. There's this whole interesting thing with the play of chastity, the play of lamb in springtime, and what this is. And I find again that her feast in late January, when the earth is still frozen in the northern hemisphere, and we know that this does influence Catholic popularity of feasts, that Agnes in some ways is starting to warm the earth up with her blood, preparing it for Blaise and Agatha and Candlemas to really instill the fire, and to allow Lady Day by March to come, and to allow Easter.
I especially like this link with Candlemas because I get a lot out of making
candles,
thread. Well, yeah, making candles.
Yeah.
But making the thread, whether that's the idea of the virgin thread, is very popular in a number of Grimoire works, and I find her day a good day to do that in terms of one of the early and most important virgin saints of virginity and chastity itself. Then also, being in some of those operations like the Verum, that you ask a maiden to make that as well. So It isn't just virgin in terms of never being used before, but it's made by a virgin as well. So imbuing it with that virtue, and that idea of spinning on that day, or even weaving, maybe thread mysteries, knot mysteries, that kind of stuff. So the idea of making a wick of some kind to be ready for Candlemas is
I would say I would hesitate to put not on it right away, only from extant practice evidence, but that starts to come in with Blaise. So northern Spain,
the crossed candles,
the thread, the yarn that is spun from sheep's wool on Saint Agnes's day, Saint Agnes's day, becomes threads that are worn around the throat on Saint Blaise's day and knotted for the first time. So the knotting becomes a kind of fixing point.
Yeah.
Once the warmth is more there.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But the shearing has already happened, obviously, because you wouldn't necessarily shear sheep on January 21st.
Right.
But the idea of spinning, that is a good time to spin, that you must start preparing the threads that are going to be used in devotional acts as well as wearing and things like that. But the start of the throat, the warming of the throat to announce spring, the throat must be, the voice must go out warm, that it could not be cold, that you must keep Blaises. And Blaise, yes, has the 2 candles, and maybe that's another great saint for us in the future. The knotting seems to happen later, at least. Again, you're going to go British, I'm going to go Iberian, but there does seem to be some evidence for it, but certainly spinning. And I'm a big fan of virgin spun thread, especially I have nun spun thread, which is pretty close to the same thing, even though the nuns I get it from, that's, they come to the abbey later in life, but I also have known those sheep and worked along those sheep, and it's a really lovely thing to be like, I know whose wool this was. So I think there's a lot of wonderful domestic goddess divinity, female divinity, things that are happening at this time of year.
The only of the pagan gods in the Golden Legend that she is named for not worshipping. It isn't just a generic set of our pagan gods. It's Vesta and the Virgins specifically.
So you're saying that paganism might be an umbrella term as opposed to a specific path.
Imagine that. Right.
Okay. But yes.
But she's mentioned specifically. The Vestal Virgins are mentioned specifically there.
Well, the idea of the lactation, which happens with Agatha coming up, this idea of the breastless saint, which is an obsession for me, given the practices, again, in Spain, and her liking to the pruning and these types of things, that we are nourished by the breastless one, and that's a whole other topic, not Agatha yet, but that there is a link here in Agnes that there is a woman that is at her tomb, and the saint's name is Emerentiana.
Oh yeah.
That is
the one that recovers Agnes's body and takes it away to be.
She's the daughter of the wet nurse,
sanctified.
Oh. So she's the daughter of the woman who breastfed Agnes, which I find very interesting. That the linking of them makes them milk sisters.
Oh.
So there is already this other saint that followed her example and was eventually killed as well and canonized. And she is, for the Anglophiles out there, it's Emerentiana and Agnes that are depicted on the cup at the British Museum. Link in the footnotes. The royal cup of gold, royal gold cup, something or other, that's like 13th or 14th century. Actually have notes and probably could look at them. The assertion that Agnes is, the argument is not just for chastity, but for identification, for self-definition, that she redefines womanhood on her terms as a martyr. It's not just following a model when she does it. It's, this is what I have decided. I have given my marriage bed to Christ. Right. As opposed to, well, I'm going to be chaste because that's what you have to do. Right. So the emphasis is interesting because she seems to be so self-asserted in these legends that say that she grew a beard, even if it's not just more body hair. To put off, is it to put off people? Is it to evidence that she understands? Is she becoming a sheep? Is it wool that she grew? All these different ideas that have come in.
Yeah. We get the merging of her and the sheep as well in the Agnus Dei, in the wax tablet, which becomes a thing certainly after the Reformation for a bunch of the probably Protestant writers to lump a bunch of old Catholic practices in with with the necromancies that are associated with Roger Bacon. And so this idea of this Baconian or pseudo-Baconian necromancy has as one of its main features when it's written about, well, these necromancers make animal sacrifice, or they make sacrifice of wax images of animals. And so the very, the most...
Like the Chinese paper things.
Right. So the most chaste and Jesus-y of these, lovely images of a lamb becomes the very thing of like, well, this is done in a bad way, and this is proof of its full inversion into a nigromantic practice of some kind.
Wax figures are great too because of what you can incorporate into them, and the idea of virgin wax being a really big sacrifice, not to just use your wax drippings. Right. Although you could make the argument magically that if you're burning candles during certain hours and things like that, that those wax drippings are great to collect all of the Mars drippings or all of the Venus drippings for our kind of cataloging, warehousing.
Especially for a secondary part of an activity. If the first part is opening a road, for instance, and the second part you need to secure what comes down that road or nail something down, then using the mess of that work is entirely apt, because it reminds the work that this thing has already been done. We've already done that. We've already opened the road. Now is the time for that prosperity or that thing we need to fix to be fixed.
And bees are a whole other topic of wonder for me, but maybe we'll broach that topic. Let's not breach that topic. That sounds painful. Broach that topic with Saint Rita. Maybe in May, because the idea of bees and the labor and the industry, as well as the Freemasonic connections and things like that, as an emblem of industry,
and the idea of the Melissa and honey, and that's many links to necromancies of antiquity,
the preservation nature of honey and things like that, and populace and the cult that goes around that. But the wax candles themselves in many cultures, especially in Iberia and France, of the first thing you do after someone dies is go and tell the bees that the master of the house is dead, because they have to make candles. Right. And you want those candles to be of virgin wax. They should be, the thing that lights them into paradise should be virgin and not used for another purpose. But that also, something to explore. Even mentioning Rita here, of Rita did not enter the convent as a virgin. She was a mob wife, basically. And her husband and children were killed. Magically, her son's possibly killed by her own wishes. That's the deal. But that she is associated with bees that produce a specific sound, odor, honey, and that it is an emblem for those that are not dying the perfect martyrdom death of a young chaste girl, that working hard in your life and dedicating yourself to a cause also produces a sweet substance to God. And therefore it is not just that you have to guard your hymen like it's like it's your hymen in the Middle Ages, but that there is something more. There is a different definition that is possible, and I think Agnes opens the way up for both, which is interesting.
Yeah.
That she is both the perfect chaste offering, and chastity, emphasizing here that chastity is not about virginity, but about canonically proper application of sexuality, where you're not using sexuality for its own, to distract you from your purpose, would be my liberal folk Catholic interpretation, as opposed to when you're not using your sexuality for making babies. But yeah, if that's the case, then yeah, that's a whole nother, anyway.
That's a whole nother thing.
Sorry. But not to apologize, I'm not a Catholic apologetic on that. I think
but I think that's worth, as you said, I think that's worth bearing in mind, that this is the idea of inventing a tradition of chastity, not of obeying what one is meant to do.
Yes, that there is a genuine connection between Agnes as the Lammas of God, the ewe of God. Although I think that's technically Rachel in the Bible. Rachel means Lamb of God. Is that correct? I think so. And Leah is described with cow eyes. But thank you, CCD. Like that. Yeah, they don't say anything except she has cow eyes, and there's the whole mandrake thing that happens between them, of trading mandrakes so that Leah could sleep with Jacob before Rachel. And yeah, anyway, mandrake. That's a whole other topic. Rachel and Leah, whole other topic. Rachel. So, okay. I don't really know how to segue into one of the other topics.
Well, there's a couple angles. So one is we can talk about lambs, and I get to use one of my favorite words, terroir, and we can talk about the kind of things that you grow around lambs, so that when they eat it, their flesh is flavored, which would be into rosemary.
So you could just say, I want the meat to taste better.
Well, there's that angle.
He's saying this, and he's a vegetarian, mind you.
It's true.
When's the last time you ate lamb?
Lamb, I don't know, like many years, over a decade, maybe a decade and a half.
Yeah.
You can still shout mint sauce at them though.
Mint sauce!
That's still fun.
Minty! And the other extension I can make is that what do you rub on amber? Wool. To make the electrons.
Oh, right.
To make it Electra.
Yeah.
Is wool. Because of the increase of static electricity. It's like we planned this, but really I just threw a bunch of easy topics for us to discuss to make sure that we recorded and get it underway.
And of course, Sagathana, amongst other things, claims to teach or preserve the mysteries of the shepherds, whatever that means. They capitalize S, shepherds there. So there's a couple of angles.
And Veludo is connected to Sufism, which is derived from wool hats and clothing. So we can justify anything. And populace is a herd of sheep.
Yeah.
That's actually, and protection magic. Watch out for those wolves dressed as sheep.
Yeah.
And strength, maybe that's a woman. That's Agnes holding that lion. You never know.
With a virtue.
Yeah, with lust, as the Book of Thoth might say. Now that we've gone through all our topics, we can end the show, I think.
And good night.
But okay, let's just now that we've actually found a segue into anything, let's start with Rosemary, because why not? This I'm going to cede to Al, because the man has a personal Rosemary cult, and I like Rosemary. But everything comes back to Rosemary for Al.
It does a little bit. I was putting it in most things. Well, one of the reasons I was putting it in most things for a while, along with cumin, is the idea of the retentive quality of it. Now, the Picatrix will say, well, Saturn is the great retainer, and that's probably the case in terms of...
Fixes the overbites.
Yep, exactly. Yep, the teeth, the bones of the face. Again, a very Saturnine thing, potentially. I like the idea of a working remembering itself to keep working. That was one of the reasons why I was using
Rosemary for remembrance.
Yeah, Rosemary for remembrance. So
apologies, Mr. Bard.
In the what is it? It's Hamlet, right?
Yes,
and it's
Ophelia
talking. Right.
The name of my first car.
Oh yeah.
Because Volkswagen bugs float.
Did did she eventually get to a nunnery?
She visited nunneries.
Yeah,
she visited nunneries, and I went to school at a Franciscan monastery. But yeah, no, it's because bugs float. I thought it was there's hope for Ophelia yet.
That's glorious.
Ophi, for short.
Aww.
72 Volkswagen White Bug with a baby blue right front fender because she got in an accident. Love that car. Anyway, Rosemary for Remembrance.
Yeah, which is not just a Renaissance English thing, but we seem to find records of it in ancient Greece, in Egypt, where it's also used in funerary rites. I like the fact of ancient Greek school kids weaving rosemary into their hair as a sort of smart drug for exams. And
knowing that rosemary is actually really good for the hair. Right. The oil in it is exceptionally good for the follicles as well as strengthening the hair and getting rid of split ends and things like that. Mm-hmm. So it's a natural conditioner, the oil.
It's also the one that comes up most often in terms of scientists now prove what herbalists have been saying for years with a bunch of those tests on memory.
They know that herbalism is still based on science, just older versions of observation, right?
Right.
It's not always just...
Yeah, empiricism was not invented in the 1500s, shall we say.
Rosemary is also... yes, the funerary herb side of it shouldn't be... I know we'll talk about it many times, but it is a prime necromantic herb in that way that coffins and bodies were both stuffed with it.
Yeah.
Because it guards against the malodorous effluvia.
Yeah, it's a strewing herb, so I mean it's good for any of those things, and like most strewing herbs, being crushed underfoot, it produces its odors and is some way kind of like not fully aerosolized, but like getting into the air in some way, and as such it has all those connections with chasing away bad spirits, unclean spirits, malevolent spirits, mischievous spirits, that kind of thing. And certainly again it's tied to the home in terms of that idea of plants of it outside the front door and taking some. There's a Spanish proverb about he who does not stop to pick a twig of rosemary will never fully respect women, or will never prosper around women, or any phrase around there. So it's also associated specifically with feminine power as well.
Well, the little blue flowers are said to get their color from when Mary was washing her clothes. She put her cloak upon it, which was blue, because Virgin Mary is blue clad.
Lady's robe, yeah.
And so it becomes the Rose of Mary. They're dyed blue. There's actually one of the Mexican Christmas songs talks about the little fishes in the river while this is going on and coming to watch the baby Jesus.
Bathing,
they say be born, but like really it's like washing her robes after he's been born in the stream and like putting her clothes on.
This idea of Epiphany being Christ's coming out, as it gets called, and this coming out is there's the birth as a kind of epiphany of like here he is world, but the main one being his baptism.
The theophany.
Yeah.
But the theophany is later on in his life from John's hands. But I always find it interesting because the emphasis too, the idea that the circumcision of Jesus becomes now the solemnity of Mary, as well as the thing. But the circumcision also is the prophecy of Saint Simeon, and acknowledging that this is the Messiah, and this Mary takes and ponders in her heart. Hiccups are limiting.
One of those things about it being not just placed on tombs or on coffins is that it was also held in procession. So we don't just have that notion of the grave and of the corpse in the grave, but of the souls marching in line to honor the dead as well.
Makes sense. I could see it being... I feel it firsthand being blurred with many other facts about cemeteries and processions in my head. But I have seen rosemary wreaths on gates. On Lish gates.
Yeah.
In firsthand in the UK. But the Santa Campagna, I just changed it from holy procession to holy bell. That's what happens when you just start floating in snot. The Santa Campagna is a procession of souls that exists in Spain, and a lot of Spanish lore in the New World as well. It's a little bit like the Wild Hunt, but rosemary is associated with that you can actually avert the way that it goes by strewing rosemary in a different path. But the concept of ghost roads and dead roads is very prominent in Spain, that your house, especially among the Basques and the Asturians and the Catalonians, of the from the door to the cemetery, from the front door of your house to the cemetery, there is a road that is owned by the house. It is the property of the house, but the house is dead. And similarly, you see this in Mexican extension about Day of the Dead, that the marigolds must line the ghost road to the cemetery. And rosemary and rue are the other herbs that are sometimes strewn with marigold, especially rosemary, just because it's so fragrant, and the marigold and the rosemary are really strong. Some groups don't like the rue just because it's said to get rid of restless dead. Other groups love it because it gets rid of restless dead. Right. So it's like, who are you praying for and who are you inviting home?
I have heard it being called elf leaf rosemary as well, or at least written about, and there's a couple of examples of sprites and the way in which various nature-ish, fayish kind of beings get lumped in with the dead as well, and specifically about their paths, and also against snakes and that which dwells under things.
That makes sense.
So that kind of,
any Marian herb too has that wonderful connection. There is an oil that I have a recipe for that I've actually made for the store that deals with the Garden of Gethsemane, and specifically has to have rosemary flowers in bloom that are added fresh. And it's interesting because the fresh ingredients always change an oil, right? And it can add an element of rot if you're not careful. And in this older oil making, yes, sometimes the smell is a guarantee or a sign that the work is going one way. But in a lot of them, the smell is always secondary to the purpose of it. And the oil has barely any smell, but affects miracles because it's, sometimes a neutral smell is good, especially when you have dead things in there. But
a sign that it's been quelled in some way.
Yeah, and sometimes a slight hint of rot happens. Sometimes, and other times, it gets kind of floral or sharp or dirt-like, and it's the other things that balance out over time.
Which is interesting in terms of rosemary, as I think one of its main qualities, if we were to keyword it, would be purifying. It purifies the memory. It isn't about keeping hold of things in the way that cumin or other saturnine things might be. It's about purifying the memory, of removing the taints and corruption and preserving. And so I can see why it has those solar connections to it very often.
Yeah, there's actually some recipes of rosemary oil being used to treat rust, but I think that's more of an association thing of like the worms that eat metal.
Right.
But rosemary is so pervasive, and it has such a strong recognizable smell that it's so interesting that, like, I've had people propose that its reason for remembrance is because it's one of the few herbs people remember. But the notion of it being a primary herb for the cemetery in Quimbanda, it's one of the first listed for the Colunga kingdom. So the kingdom of the cemetery, or the kingdom of Colunga Grande, which is the ocean acting as a cemetery, this boundary between, and it does have a very water-like
It's very important in bats, right, in Amasi.
Yeah. And this idea of initiations sometimes can be done solely with a few succulents and rosemary. And it's the rosemary is because of the vibrancy of the smell, which is heavily used in Latin American traditions from both indigenous and African influence, but that its relationship to the cemetery comes from European sources, but is readily and absolutely appropriated through syncretism of like in Mexico. If we jump back there, rosemary replaces native plants. The Spanish forbade certain plants to be grown, just as marigolds are a replacement for another plant.
So it stands there in remembrance of something
else.
Yes, of a thing that was crushed by colonialism.
Yes, and so Mary comes and steps on the serpent of the natives and replaces things with her own herbs. And so the coding of and the blinds even of certain Marian herbs are either indigenous herbs of great medical or spiritual import, and other plants get other names. So it's just it's an interesting conundrum. I find also the variance in rosemary essential oil smells depending on where it grows and the camphor content that happens. So you can get a very camphoritic, and it ends up, sage and rosemary can have more camphor than actual camphor.
Right.
Just the smell of it, or it can be very subdued and have a different smell. But rosemary being one of those plants that people often talk about, you must ignore it. You must forget about rosemary for it to thrive when you're growing it, because if you overwater it, overtend to it, that it doesn't do well. It's also used in floral crowns, to weave in Queen of the May things. So when you're adding in the flowers
Oh, yeah,
to wear
yeah.
on the head, it, because of its Marian associations, it becomes a crown of life as opposed to the crown of thorns. And so you'll see a lot of temporary crowns that are given to, like, Santísima Muerte in Mexico are made out of rosemary, which echoes the crown of thorns, but you're not putting a crown of thorns on her.
It's a standard feature in the Middle Ages. The troubadours, the lays of the troubadours, often call it coronaria. Like it's literally the crown guy or the crown lady plant. So yeah, and it's a long-standing thing in terms of garlands of it being placed on tombs and on coffins.
Wreaths of rosemary and bay,
right?
Another necromantic herb.
Mm-hmm.
It's very interesting.
It's also, certainly in terms of crowns, it was something that I was using to aid memory, to build a crown of it, and while I was studying and trying to pour a bunch of information that needed to be kept in my brain, and making offering of those to the Three Kings is also a practice found all over the place.
Three Kings Magi or Three Kings Demons?
Magi.
Okay, just clarifying, it's your mouth. I don't know which one sometimes.
If I'm talking four kings, then I'll usually say regents to distinguish. If I'm talking the three chiefs, who in counterpart to the capeta,
yeah, okay,
then they'll be chiefs. So the Magi, from a 12th century mystic having a vision of them taking their crowns off in front of Christ and then having them blessed and put back on, were about giving their crowns as much as receiving them, and that could be monetary, like a crown. That was a thing that English kings did, along with giving the gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. But I was making them out of rosemary for a while for those kinds of crowning reasons and that purifying stuff. And I have talked to a couple of folks who said that their Hispanic, older relatives, their abuelas, would cleanse the house with with rosemary stalks.
Rosemary and rue are very common for limpias and limpiezas, depending. The term changes. Romero is heavily used for herbal passings. I think also because even as much as rue can be used, it's used in tandem with rosemary, but there's this habit of breaking something after you've cleaned off somebody with it. So right. Rosemary snaps, whereas rue really doesn't.
Yeah.
But rue and rosemary are the couple that are they absorb and purify and cleanse and correct in the pasas over the body, and the copal or frankincense and myrrh, wherever the resins are the things that fumigate the room. So, and interestingly, right? So there's dark and light copal, and that's the frankincense and myrrh parallels. When they don't have those, they use light copal and dark copal. Yeah, it's very interesting.
We get a bunch of stuff with rosemary about it being used in various formulas for youth. Hungary water, as it was called at one point, heavily uses rosemary oil, and this idea of a plant of immortality, in some cases in some of the French florography, the language of the flowers. And that's interesting in light, again, if we are comparing or talking about it in parallel with Agnes, this idea of like a return to youth and innocence and those kinds of things. And again, the idea of it removing blemishes.
I totally thought you were done. That scared me. Removing blemishes, okay.
Yeah, warcraft and things like that. But again, that idea of purifying, of cleansing, of being brought back to some kind of the virginal state that you are brought back to, rather than that which is lost forever, and is guarded like something that can't be, that can't be re-achieved.
I'm with you. I'm just going to straight segue into amber then. Amber, in addition to being like a Jurassic Park thing, because that's pretty, let's face it, it's pretty fucking cool. The preservation of ancient DNA in tree sap, and it could, I could stretch it to say copal. Amber is fossilized, old, tumbled, waterborne, oftentimes. Copal, whereas copal is fresh. But amber, there's a lot of synthetic amber out there, and there's man-made amber that's actually from tree sap sometimes, and the mark of good amber is that you could still burn it and it would smell like tree resin.
Yes, looking at like ancient amber beads that seem to have been deliberately broken and then put back together. One of the ways they're put back together is with iron wire or with some kind of metal wire, and it seems the wire is heated until it melts into the two pieces of amber to hold them together. So it isn't lashed. They're little stitch-like looking things.
And the value of it too is that yes, it occurs in many places around the world. But you talk about the Baltic amber trade, and that it is specifically Baltic amber in Europe that is so heavily traded and of value. So in addition to its properties as a stone that causes electricity, that has the electra itself that is rubbed with wool and creates a static charge.
Right, it's a magic stone.
Yes,
it produces tangibly magical effects.
And then it's also prized because it is expensive on top of it, that it's traded for. So the different associations with amber, this because of its color, because of its emanating energy, a very solar, immediately solar connotations, its association with life and invisible forces very quickly there.
According to Ovid, it is the tears of the Heliads who are transformed into trees and are mourning their dead brother Phaethon. According to the Metamorphoses. This is in Claude Lecouteux's Lapidary. And similarly, a Christian legend says that amber was born there from the tears shed by pine trees during the flood. So again, we get Noah turning up again.
Noah. And making those pine trees cry. I guess it was really Jesus. I just blame the flood on Jesus.
Time traveling Jeebus.
Well, he is pre-eternal and pre-existing, but thus saith John. But that Father God makes the pine trees cry, making the baby Jesus cry.
Lacouteau also goes on to frustratingly hand wave and say, in other traditions, they are the tears of seabirds. So, I don't know which traditions they are.
Okay.
But again, we have a sort of maritime connection as well.
Yeah, I'll bring it all back to the whole thing of the Rosemary being a Kalunga herb and that being the ocean in some form, and the seabirds are flying over, and pine as the source of what this is. That sap is fossilized in this way, but pine as a mourning tree is always interesting to me. The pine wood box, because it's a cheap wood.
Right.
Pine is really the basic wood of construction. If you're that you're going to hide, you don't want to build permanent things out of your pine unless you're me, and then all of your furniture is built out of pine.
We also have that thing of that sometimes gets talked about in terms of hoodoo traditions of the two main sets of smells that we agree smell clean, depending on particular cultural markers or whatever, are often the pine ones and the lemony ones,
or pine sol, which is both.
Right.
Pine sol, pinesol. Pine itself being associated with funerary practices, again in Iberia, because of after a certain point, there's a pine line on a mountain, and only pine grows above it, and small grasses, so the other trees can't grow above a certain height, and therefore the closer things to the sky god, the closer things to heaven, are actually pine trees.
Is there any Crucero lore around pines?
Not that I know of. I mean, the piñón in Brazil is a different tree. It looks very much like a Dr. Seuss tree, and you eat the pine nuts from it. They look like little roaches. It very much looks like a Dr. Seuss tree. I'll footnote a picture of it. But there are relatives of the pine down there. It's just a very different tree tropically than the evergreen coniferous trees. But also the tree being promising ever life, life everlasting. And the tree chosen of the Saturnalia and the tree magics of Yule. But pine is a difficult wood to burn because of its high sap content and the sparkling that happens from that. But wonderful because it grows fast and provides a basic support for other things. But it does sweat. It sweats the resin.
Right. Very sticky.
So it does do that.
And pine gathered from, say, Greenwood Cemetery, the pine resin there. growing from the bones of the dead, and these tears of mourning. Again, very useful for nigromantic incenses.
We totally did a tangent on pine here, but the red pine and white pine and the edibility of them and things like this, that you can eat the needles when they're fresh, and red pine clusters of 3, white pine clusters of 5, like the letters, and this moving into needle-based plants, and again echoing crown of thorns type of things.
Right.
The thing with amber that's interesting too is that a lot of times now the scent of amber is actually a substitute for ambergris.
Oh, okay.
It's a synthetic ambergris.
I thought we were going to go Storexy kind of territory there, but yes, right, ambergris, which being incredibly expensive, makes sense that it would start attracting a number of substitutes.
Yeah, so a lot of what we associate with amber is trying to be ambergris. I love the this notion of it that there's an Indian group of incenses that I've purchased since I was a wee thing from Cost Plus, and it used to be like, I don't know, 99 cents, maybe $3.99 now, for 105 sticks of very smoke producing but very strongly scented incenses. And it used to be the one that said musk was actually a picture of a whale on it, and then it said amber in parentheses. And it's talking about whale musk smells, which, just this idea of ambergris smelling like that. True ambergris is quite amazing when you smell it. And I think, yes, it might be a stretch to incorporate too much lore about ambergris on an episode where we're talking about amber. But since they are often confused, that the scents are substituted, ambergris itself is pretty damn amazing. And smells very different fresh than it does after it's been hardened and matured. If you hear chewing, that's one of my rats deciding that he's making a guest appearance by watching us and pulling up a kernel of kibble. It's Bartholomew, the elder, the skin flayer. Okay, so amber. We'd be remiss to not at least mention the necklace of amber and jet that is now traditional to traditional Wicca. The idea that this belongs to the High Priestess, and there are many arguments about this back in the bulletin board days, the electric bulletin board days, and the old AOL days. I remember, again, as a wee thing, seeing the arguments about can males wear it? Can males wear the circlet of amber and jet? And the flow that happens between dead matter, which is jet, which is fossilized, and living matter, which is amber, and the cycle of life and death and incarnation, and the passing from priestess to priestess to priestess to priestess who rules a coven. And of course, I have a great deal of respect for the impulse behind and the lore and the sheer balls of early Wicca. But I don't want to be nihilist and be like, it's every tradition is made up in its way. But I find it interesting that the dialogue was that it was a woman's thing, and that there are many men who now wear it and will be called out by different priestesses for it. That a single piece is very different from a circlet around the neck, and that the garter and the amber and jet necklace are worn by priestesses. The snake garter.
And what's and that's the main set of criteria as to why it's amber and jet, the living.
I believe so is the as I was told, but I'm sure the pharaohs have an explanation. But that's it's been a good 20 years since I really dove into those books, Sal. But the memory of it is still there. The static, and especially if you're skyclad, that there's these symbol tokens of authority. There's very few in the circle, and the garter and the woman girt with a sword, who's carrying the sword, and who is the maiden, and who are these different things, is important. And so the jewelry makes sense, and that it is a high priest and a high priestess that could possibly wear amber and jet, but that really is the alternating patterns of amber and jet belonged to the high HPPS. Is that right? HPPS? HPSS? I don't remember. HBS. There we go. Let's just put it that way. High priestess. Amber is, as far as associations past that, is associated for me with Oshun. And we use amber in the Oshun family. So amber as a tree sap could be given still not just to Oshun, but to her son Ideu, or Idou, the child that was born after twins that was her beloved that she never let go of. Amber, especially with butterflies in it, is, the more valuable it is, the more interesting it is, of course, to Oshun. But it's also said to be why some people put orange or red. The red stands for coral when we use a red bead many times as an accent, but the orange is often a substitute for amber. Or the idea of amber colored, and therefore Oya takes amber as well as Oba. So there's a notion, a flow of these tree sap, this blood of trees, and there's other things that I would love to talk about, but I'd also get slapped by my godparents. Self-preservation is a thing, right? Don't want to endanger the relationships you have. But there's some beautiful mysteries into the winds and the saps of the trees, tree blood, and this type of thing. But yeah, so amber is there, amba, and is one of the primary colors of Oshunzeleke. Some houses it's very yellow, and other houses use what they call honey-colored beads or amber, and amber looks like hardened honey. Right. And produces this warmth from it, this spark. Right. Which,
and this is one of the central substances of Oshun, right? That when we offer her honey, we are encouraged often to taste it as well.
Yes.
Right. That it's not just a thing that we only have her, that she brings the flow of sweetness.
Yeah, and well, our myths say that it's actually to make sure that we didn't poison it because she was poisoned by honey. So it's proving to her that you're not offering her something that will kill her. But I like the much more positive spin that you just put on it of it's just sharing her sweetness. Sometimes we do put honey in the mouth or molasses in the mouth to sweeten our words. And so that when our ashe comes to our breath, that it is literally through a voice of sweetness. It's interesting because you do that with amber and like charge yourself up all with static electricity before you talk to a fast moving god like Mercury. What would it do? I don't know. And touch the statue. Especially if you've made gold being such a good conductor. If you've done gold leaf on any part of it, it could be very interesting to move the current around. Experiments. Expedients. Yeah. What say you more about amber, sir?
Well, amber, it's not something I've used a great deal. Honestly, I mean, looking through a couple of books on beads, which kind of started as early as we could go with beads. The idea of using tree sap or using things that we might think of like resins that we might think of more as incenses, as precious things that could be bored and then strung on something is really interesting.
I think the natural segue there is to the hugely broad topic that we've locked in for ourselves, which is protection magic. Just the nature of stone and herb lending themselves well to protection magic. Not that amber is by necessity always a protective mineral. Certainly rosemary is...
Absolutely, yeah. And what do we... protection can be defined in not any number of ways, but many numbers of ways. And that idea of protection as cleansing as protection. I mean, this is what we get from talking about
prophylactic protection there.
Right. We get that. We get martial notions of the fiery cleanse of bleach or something. But also the idea of asperging, and certainly that's something that Rosemary is used of in a lot, isn't simply to consecrate a space or to make it nice. There's also a powerful sense of protection going on there, protection for the operator, and potentially protection for the sets of spirits that are being called into that space.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. It's like the pocket full of posies things, right? That you're actually protecting yourself from the bad airs, the malaides of disease and decay by holding something smelling good by your face. It's not just a way to make you avoid the smell, but the smells actually contain the thing, which is actually pretty scientific. We just didn't know that it was until, that when you smell something, it's like every time you smell poop, you're actually tasting poop too. That it is tiny little molecules of pupe have gone up your nose and you are on your tongue as well.
Right, which is why I'm annoyed when people talk about how, plague doctors only look like that to be scary and fetishy and cool. As opposed to having a tangible purpose to being able to stuff as many herbs down that big beak-looking thing as possible. An early respirator.
So plague doctors wore that to be fashionable? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, absolutely, to be fashionable and to make Etsy shop sellers feel creative.
Well, also it's the pantalone nose, like this long phallic nose of Commedia dell'arte. It's like all of a sudden that was my first association. I saw plague doctor masks later, and I was like, why are all these Commedia characters administering to the dead and dying? Like, what's going on here? And also that the masks themselves are often much bigger or much smaller. It's a variance. It doesn't look like a normal mask. I was curious for a second of... I forgot. Oh, well, go on. There was something really witty and punny that I was going to say, and therefore, because it was witty and head-derived as opposed to actually something of interest, I've just made an ass of myself. So,
well, getting at what healing does, which is how I wanted to think about protection magic, not to already make the field even bigger, but the idea of healing as destroying something that is trying to destroy you, that there is a war potentially going on.
Are we both having tea hiccups? Is that what's going on?
Potentially, yeah.
Okay. What are you drinking?
We just call them hiccups.
Are you drinking Earl Grey?
Yes.
Okay. We're twins today.
Earl Grey Supreme.
It's one of the few times we're drinking the exact same tea.
Aww.
I didn't used to put milk and honey in my tea, and now I do, and I feel like it just protects me from having bad tea. I'm tying it in. See what I did there? So it looks... Oh, this is what I was thinking. It's a tangent, but for many of us, bleach is a securing smell. And I'm curious, I wonder if someone could do a safe bleach incense, because that would invoke cleanliness and protection to me from it would actually, it would fool you, of course, because maybe you didn't actually use bleach, but the smell of bleach itself is something that many of us, and many Hispanic households, this overuse of bleach, where you walk into the bathroom and suddenly you're finding yourself like you've been mustard gassed, is quite a thing. And then also, for anybody that has ever been around the bugs that shall not be named for many people in New York, but if you've ever had bed bugs, which many people have, it is rubbing alcohol becomes your security blanket, and if you pour that over things, it kills them. So the smell of rubbing alcohol can be also one of those smells that is not pleasant, but evokes a pleasant security.
Cleansing can be a protective act, just as protection can be a cleansing act.
Yes, and this idea, as long as we don't take it quite to an obsessive level of now I've burnt my 20 sticks of bleach incense and I'm okay.
Compulsively misophobic.
Yeah.
Right.
But this notion of protection is interesting because I think also the quality of what protection is has changed over the years, and there's different spell classifications that we do that might explore the bridge from early modern concepts to other cultural conceptions of protection. The idea of, is a good defense the best offense? Is the good offense the best defense? In this way of, are we talking aggression? And even looking through the different planets, for all of them can protect you from something.
Yes.
So again, if we've talked about, as we have many times, about health being holistic, and that if you have a disease of money, that you would be poor, and that you're trying to figure out how to erase the poverty disease that it is, just as bodily health is its own thing. So again, mercurial protection would be very different. It might be invoked for protection from thieves, as well as lies, nightmares, protection while traveling, not protection from traveling. But this
much more saturnine.
Yeah. So the sedentary. I invoke the sedentary cow god.
The thrones.
But each planet itself affording a different type of protection is very
absolutely. Yeah. And I think that health model is a really good example, as is the idea of the equilibrium, that any planet can rule by contrary and by governance, by ennobled governance, and that you can just as you can use any of them to protect, you could presumably use any of them to unbalance, to curse, for want of a better term. In that our model of suffering itself is so based on Greek notions of balance being the basis of not just harmony or beauty, but also of proper operation.
There is a pitfall here in much modern thought of, what is this herb used for? What is this stone used for? It's used for protection, but if it's used for protection, it can probably also be used for the antithesis, destruction in some form. Even though its energy is something different, there is a way to spin that.
Right.
And that is a very common property in extant older traditions, early modern practice, this idea that both sides of something are contained, that the broom and the dust are contained within each other, that fertility and infertility are contained within each other, and that this substance that can, following the maxim of one can turn two, oh my gosh, I said oh my gosh instead, oh my god, wow, it is, this being sick takes you back to like being 5 years old. But if one can cure, two can kill. The balance of dosage itself is important in any of these things, that it is not just the symbol of a plant and what it is. It might be, because again, there's multiple layers to herbal associations that can be mythological, chemical, appearance, or location based. And there's more than that probably, but those are the four primary that come into mind constantly. And protection might be a plant that's good for protection is one that forms a natural barrier.
Right.
It might be one that binds things. It could change, but these are based on physical properties, not necessarily a plant that is always growing that way, or a location of plants growing around a fort would naturally have.
Yeah. But I think that's fair, because our tendency is often with protection to think about it as like pushing back on something, right? And so things that repel or antipathetic in some form are going to have that quality of there, as well as that which borders, right? I suppose as well, that which it completely covers something as well. That idea of like the completion of something, the totality of its like unbroken line around something as well, which is always interesting to me in terms of red brick dust and the idea of like grinding something down so that it forms something that can be perfectly malleable as each of the grains forms like a line.
The inclusion of ivory and incense to echo the elephant tusk of drawing a circle to keep scorpions out. There's to have the ashes of a fire then be used to demarcate the boundary of the fire's reach, so that you also see where it can protect, and the circles of influence, the spheres, which in some ways are forming orbs. Orbs of influence or orbs of protection, akin to planetary influence.
Spheres.
Spheres. Circles.
And the idea of the static point that you turn around to produce the circle. I think that's interesting. Looking at the Denigromancia, a thing that I don't see as much of is the idea of like the runway that you open up and then close again to get into the circle, and then close it off again. And so there's these various circle diagrams with like this kind of magic runway. That's the kind of what's the word I'm looking for? Like airlock.
Well, it carried over into modern neo-paganism, right? Of the broom being the access point into the circle, and then if the broom is physically removed, then the access point is gone, and the super elastic bubble plastic of the magic circle. Yes, Carol, I used your expression. A Georgian priestess friend of mine. But the notion too that the three-dimensional sphere is not always as universal, that the physical circle itself is almost, because of the flat earth nature of cosmology here, that it goes down into the depths of hell and goes high into heaven like an elevator.
Yeah, it's this, and that this cylinder.
Yeah, so it's a pneumatic tube of spirit travel. And that brings a whole different thing, like pathworking, right?
I've seen people do glass elevator style, or talk about doing glass elevator style pathworking stuff. The tree being that which you go up and down, entering the tree and then going up and down in it, like having that quality.
And there was a really beautiful argument once between, it was like 7 different Kabbalists from different traditions, including 3 very Orthodox Jewish interpretations on things, but talking about the problem that the one-way flow of the Mesla flow, is there, and can you actually go up the tree? And what are you doing, or are you actually going off of your memory as a spirit descending, and therefore memory is imperfect and cannot be trusted to be universal. It could be a personal thing, but that your individual fall into matter informs your ideas of what the spheres above you are, because the mesla flows one way. So you cannot actually travel up, but merely down until such time as you are immaterial again.
Which is nice that it's a... I mean, that's awesome. The idea of the fall not just being a punishment, but being like how we remember how to climb again, or at least construct the projections of those rungs. That's really cool. I also really like the idea of rather than thinking about it only being stars and the Maslow and the fall of the fruit of the stars, that we think about it as a tree specifically, because of course you've got the sap that rises and the sap that falls as almost two separate. There's separate words for them, right? In many traditions. That's interesting.
We brought ourselves back to amber in some form there. The sap that rises and falls and creates static electricity, which is funny because it means stasis, but you're talking about a high activity of also almost a field that is formed around it.
Oh man, that's also kind of populace-y.
Huh.
That's nice.
And protection from the crowd, god damn it. Them out there at the point of my extended finger. Thank you, Peter Gray. Yeah, I mean, protection magic is a whole other thing. There's also extensions of protection magic. One of my favorites is an election that I used again in an oil, but looking at Mars as a very scorpionic Mars. Yes, because traditional astrology, but as a point of converting enemies to friends, or at least to neutral. And that this is a form of protection, that transformative, metamorphic relationship magic is a form of protection. So this is a very specific one, that enemies will pass you by, that you flit from their mind while they are near you, which is, it's another form of invisibility.
Right.
So, but it is... not a permanent invisibility. It's that, like, they can see you from afar, but as they get close, something changes.
Right.
But okay, so if we go into this segue that you lovingly pointed out of populace. Populace of 2-2-2-2, or complete non-elemental activity.
Yeah.
So what is it if it's not any of the four?
If two dots in a geomantic figure of the four lines of it represents inactivity or passivity or withdrawal of some kind, it's an interesting one, because you've got the most dots capable in a figure, right? All 8 dots. So you have the notion of it as the crowd, right? You have the notion of it being the most things. Also the congregation, those that gather around a specific thing. You also have the notion of it being, if we take, instead of 2 being inactive and coming apart, we also have the notion of 2 coming together to get to 1. So this closing nature of it, and this inactivity that it then breeds in various forms, or passivity, which we can find expressed, I think, well through the idea that it can be both a dissipation, where nothing particularly happens, where when you need things to be free, it is closed. You are packed in like sardines. When you need things to be packed in, it dissipates like air in a room. That there's this quality of it coming apart at the edges a little bit, of not in a raggedy way, but in a just like dissipating fashion, right? And that's why it is both the small town where nothing really happens, and also the tiny overbooked venue where you can never get a table. Both of these things are kind of populace-y, which is odd because it's both an absence of activity and, in other cases, too much activity.
Well, a perfect example for me was something your wife pointed out once. We were walking in a group. It's like 9 occultists in a group walking to a restaurant after a talk. I just called us occultists.
No.
We are the hidden ones.
It's self-deprecating.
Just call us Amonette. But we were walking and we hit a street corner and we were trying to decide which way to go. And it took an inordinately long amount of time, because some people try to cross the street during a red light and other people are like, no, let's wait. And your wife was just like, and populace. Which was a really... It might have actually been 8. I picked 9, but it could be the convenient number of dots. But the point was that a group, even though it's enjoying itself,
Mhm.
was bordering on, not on indecision, but on too much decision, which led to a form of indecision.
Right.
Because
Herding
the group
cats.
mind was trying to go a certain way.
Yeah.
And it's a wonderful example of populace as an energy, that populace can be too many options, and therefore too many voices, and you have to challenge with it to produce fruit, is a leader needs to arise. So there's almost like another figure has to come out of it. And I'm hinting it, of course, with the comparison of the Odú Ejioko, or Oyekun, as it's known in Ifa, and then in Dilogo and Ejioko. But the notion of how closely the earth is connected to this Odú, that if Ogbe, correspondent to Via, is the light rising in the east, that the earth receiving that light is Ejioko, and therefore Ejioko provides tremendous wealth for those that can embrace this agricultural cycle of you must plant seeds and they must be put away for a certain amount of time. It's investing in the future. It's investing and allowing time to pass. It is a very Saturnine thing because of that. It is an absorptive Saturn as earth monster, as like the Aztec earth monster that eats the setting sun.
Yeah.
This notion of the earth as terrifying but productive, and the darkness of the womb, and the darkness that time is necessary. This is where death comes into the world, because it eats the light of Ogbe. It is the container that is inviting light to come into it, the vacuum that draws things into it. So here you have heavily connected to the ideas of hunter and the hunted, that death stalks us here. Death becomes a friend and a bride. So Oshosi is married to death, and becomes the hunter marries death and learns this mystery, that here the hunter's obsession with finding the prey and what truth is, to try and define the light and understand Ogbe and the stricture of Ogbe, leads to him shooting an arrow into the air to try and find a thief, and the thief was his mother who was preparing the food. So it's the death of his own mother there. There's so many things, and of course these stories appear in different Odus depending on the town you're talking to, or which publication off of Lulu you're pirating, or whatever it is. But the notion of conflict, of relationship, of opposition, because it is the second oldest in the rankings. So you have Ogbe followed by Oyekun, or Ejiogbe or Ejiunle followed by Ejioko. And Oko here, bringing up notions of Orisha Oko, the agricultural Orisha, or Oko the penis, just the different notions of the hard work that goes into making something fruitful.
Right.
And it is that in order for death to claim its prize, in order for us to eat meat, we want the thing to grow to a larger point. We want the plant to mature before we kill it. We've got to fatten the little Hansel and Gretel's up, or we'll stay skinny witch.
Right.
And it's hard not to bring that knowledge of this Odú to populace, because I see so many divergent ideas about what populace is, because it is a natural state of confliction, because there's always going to be more than one view on what populace is by its own nature.
It is a figure of being a figure of the moon. It is not to say that that's its only planetary virtue or context, but being that lunar figure and the other lunar figure at that, right? The other side, not the moon constantly changing, moving across the sky of Via, the sliver of light guiding your way, but also taking you to a place where you have no idea what's going on. Like the constant changing of things, of dark and silver in the night, but rather the other moon, the moon that other people think the moon is, right? Other people's drawings of the moon, the wrong ones, like this wealth of opinions about the moon, and about duplicity and the double, and you and what you bring, the baggage of things around you, all that kind of stuff adds into it as well. I think the most fascinating thing about populace, when it turns up in an important place, or when it produces an important thing, that idea of the fecundity of it, is that owing to the maths of things, any figure that's added to populace will produce that figure again. We get that lunary, watery, reflective quality of like this passing through it will produce the same thing, in charts where, say, you're trying to work out in a geomantic reading, not just what the answer to the client's query is, but how to phrase it to the client to be most useful to them. You can often look at that in terms of the querent's the first house of the querent, and then whichever house you end up using to talk about you, the diviner, which I've heard as 7, I've also heard as 6, and that notion of
why?
Oh, I think it's 6 because you're the worker, and you're doing it, and you're also inquiring after the health, and 7 therefore would be the after that. So there's some notion of or there's the idea of 7th as the partner in working this thing out together.
Because that notion of indenture to a client that has paid you, I know comes up for some people too. Right. Of like, I'm your servant right now, which can also influence how things go.
And if it's the 2nd house from the 6th as well, 6th being the first, counting it that way. So there's things borrowed from
you realize this makes no sense to people who don't know house architecture. Like, it's just more confusing. And this is why people think astrologers and traditional magicians are crazy.
Yeah. Okay. Well, there are ways in which one can look at a chart.
Do a house course.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. House course. There are ways in which you can look at a chart and get not just the answer, but a variety of ways that you might be able to frame that as useful to the client. One of the things I've found is that if the figure you are looking for, wherever that is populous, that the client will project things onto you. That if the client is represented in the 1st house as Tristitia, as sorrow, and whatever house you're looking for, yourself and how they're perceiving you is populous, anything plus populous will always equal whatever went into it. So sadness comes out of it again, that the client is attempting to continue their patterns, right? So there's that notion of the continuance of something, the inertias of if a thing is in motion, it'll stay in motion. If a thing's at rest, it'll stay at rest. So there's that quality to it that I'm really interested in as well. And that there is a sense of it being, of something that's shared amongst a crowd, being either good for things that are good to be shared or bad for things that are bad to be shared. There's qualities of telephone games.
How mercurial. Good with good and bad with bad. Or just good with bad to fuck you up. I mean, Ejioko Oyekun has these notions of the paths of the sun and the moon because of now you have an opposition. So we're talking about in the order of Odú, which changes from Dilagun to Ifa and Ifa to Dilagun. But we understand that the nature of it, that Ogbe is the senior Odú in the east, and that Oyekun or Ejioko is the antithesis, the corresponding answer to it in the west. And therefore you have a path now. This is not an uncommon thing with 2, that now there's a road, there's a destination. Some cultures would view that as 3, and I will say that there are several cultures that I really respect that view the road as 3, not 2, because there is the destination, there's you, and there's the road. So it is a different thing, or that a picture actually evokes 3, that there's the thing it represents, there's you, and there's the picture as the medium, as the road. Right. But the notion of the first road forward, that's a direction. It's not a destination.
Right, it's a vector, yeah.
And so there's this unknown star that you're charting towards. And so Ejioko Oyekun deals with the paths of the sun and the moon, the seasons, cycles, things going from 1 to 2 and 2 to 1 if we want to follow it or 0 to 1 and 1 to 0 in a binary system. But positive, negative, positive, and back. And it is through the mating of Via and Populus comparatively, or through the mating of Ogbe or Ejunle and Ejioko, that all other combinations come through, because you have single mark and you have 2 mark. Yeah. All the way down. They can be connected as they are in Ifa when signs are similar, you draw, connect the dots. But that here you're dealing with the forces that we cannot see. So it is defined by its unknowingness. Yeah. It's defined by its lack of definition. So Ogbe is what we know, and Oyekun becomes what we don't know. And this is echoed in agriculture again, in the fecundity of the earth. We plant something in the ground, we don't know if it's going to grow. We hope that it does, and we nurture it, but it is praising unseen forces of germination, of darkness, of the things that make the night. We don't know if the sun will rise. We hope it will, but we must give in to the cycles that allow for germination and growth in darkness. So here also you have a constant contrast in energies. The idea of the arrows between brothers, that relationships become stressed, that a relationship should be secure, but it's not. It's in danger because of jealousy, because of the status change between the two relationships. Right. So there is an inequality the minute you have two. It's very hard to maintain equality. And what Orisha do we have that's in two constantly is Ibeji, and we always make sure we give them the sacred twins that we'll give them the same offerings, so they aren't at war with each other and therefore with us. Right. Of you gave him more, you gave her more. Right. So this constant understanding of duality is about maintaining a balance, a very strict balance with the very deity that we invoke for duality. So this affects everything from concepts of twinship as a minor Orisha, but understanding a very complex dualism that is not dualistic, but without being dualism, I suppose, is probably the better way of doing it, which is a very, indigenous exploration for me. It's just the obsession with that in, just made it about me, just noting I did that. But the structure of the Aztec universe and Mexica thought of looking at duality as the foundational block upon which something exists, but not in opposition as two warring factors in this very European dualistic way, but that duality is the thing contains its own opposite, that they are not automatically have a relationship. So it's the symbol of Olin, which is it looks like the seal for Saturn of an upright V and a downright V, or an upright triangle and a downright triangle, forming the six-pointed star, forming this tension symbol, which this interaction between positive and negative allows for things to be conceptualized after that point. So you can follow this, and it makes Malinali the twisted rope, the rope that comes out of this duality. And this notion of this, interestingly, is that the rope becomes a mat, which is Nepantla is the formation of all reality. So Nepantla is the way that things are interwoven in the spaces in between, but it's made up of conceptual threads, which when you look down to the atoms is created through duality and understanding those opposing forces. And I think there's something to that, building out of Ejioko and the interaction with
perpendicularity
of
the warp and the weft.
There has to be, first there is the tension that maintains the tautness of the thread. So if we go into spinning things, again, Agnes and the spinning, but that there's threads going different ways, that you're folding it in half almost to then go back and make it thicker. And so there's counterclockwise, clockwise going all at once. And that this is important to maintaining a tautness and providing structure and form upon which to weave and build something that is bigger, that we rely on the tension, and the tension which gives form, but only comes from the interaction between that which is known and that which is unknown.
Oiling the canvas on the frame kind of thing. You have like the tensions that start to form that allow things to be spun on them, like the loom or whatever.
Yeah. Then, it's this, it goes one step beyond, I again, going back to that Iberian conceptual, the concepts of sun and moon there, especially if you look at Euskal Herria, Basque concepts of sun and moon, and concepts of what is seen and what is unseen. So it is not as simple as proposing light and less bright light, which in the West it kind of is. Still, we associate the Artemis Apollo thing, or here it's two sisters, and we're dealing with life and stillborn. We're dealing with the structure of anything, positive space itself being connected to the sun, that which we can see, and negative space, the thing that defines the positive space, is the moon, because the moon goes away. And so the concept of death and absence being tied to the moon, which is a different concept than just saying two forces that are fighting each other. We can't see the other force.
Right.
And here it's similar to that with Ejioko, of we cannot see the other force. We don't know what happens when we put something in the ground. We have past evidence, we have trust, but we cannot see it. And when you merge into a crowd, it's like playing Assassin's Creed, right? You're going to go into a crowd or hide amongst the dancing ladies. And you're going to blend in, and your target's not going to see you.
Again, we're into like invisibility and hunter mysteries.
Yes.
Right.
So you hide in the bush and don't move because you're surrounded by things, or you go above them. And yes, I just revealed that I'm an Assassin's Creed nerd, but the notion of hiding in plain sight,
yeah.
In the forest for the trees, it is a very difficult concept.
Yeah.
To intellectualize, but it makes so much sense when you just start living it.
Yeah. Hiding in plain sight is a very different thing to literally disappearing.
Yeah.
Or your absence, or conjuring your absence.
I think this tension that is forming here, again, just to segue it into something else, because that's what we do. You can come back to it. The tension that forms there, that allows for form. It's the tension that allows for form, and especially Mexica, Nahuatl universe of the Aztecs, that understanding. But this opposition gives strength.
The axis of the graph that allows you to then plot things on it.
Similarly, our conceptions of the strength card of tarot, some of the older cards are a woman with a broken column. It is breaking. The columns are breaking. Could this be Samson, made of men, a long-haired Samson that is mistaken for a woman? Some suggest. It could be the woman holding the lion's mouth open, and it reminds me of what they talk about with an alligator, that you can actually hold the alligator's mouth closed because it doesn't have as many muscles to open it. It has muscles that close it. So it's very easy to just wrap your arms around the snout. I don't want to try that in person, but that strength is derived from understanding the opposite of something, and possibly in this Aikido-like way of using it to your advantage, that you use the force of the other person to disable them. There's something there.
That makes a lot of sense. Not being where they're punching and hitting them with the biggest thing around the ground, right? is ways I've heard it phrased. But the best protection being not being there.
And one of my favorite things in Aikido too is like someone comes at you and you flip them, and it always inevitably show them where to land with your hand. It's like pointing. It's like those queens that walk the runway and they point to the other side of the stage before they get there. But here you're doing it with another person. So
it's a sense of I've also heard it described as a great yes saying of like, oh, you're moving so quickly, you'd like to be over there? Well, I will help you go over there.
Your gravity is so forceful. Let me introduce you to the earth which you seek. So the strength, I mean, there's tons of mysteries around the strength card, of course. I know that the notes, I'm going to pull them out to cheat, but that the card, I know that notes aren't cheating, but they still feel like it. It's the oral tradition thing of like, I should know this. That the card numbers changed, right? And that the Rider Waite did change it, and now we perceive that as the numbering. Justice and strength switch.
8 and 11,
so it goes back and forth, and
which is interesting in terms of the other one being usually associated with Lamed and the ox goad and prodding, and Lamed as teacher being in the middle, and then having this idea of the tension between
teacher and Lamed being the snake as well, and the Gnostic interpretations of all these.
Exactly, the notion of that being swapped with Teth, the serpent, is interesting.
I don't know, strength is, I mean, it's a fairly, in English, it's a weird word because it almost always denotes the physical properties of something. And yet, I think conceptually, can you speak more to the early modern notions of strength? Because it seems like it's hinting at something more than just physical.
I mean, what are the other virtues?
Well, because this is also fortitude, right? Originally, strength is fortitude.
There we go.
So you're talking about a balance of things and applying modicum, and knowing how much strength to exhibit.
Right. That
there is strength in knowing how much strength you have,
and knowing how much to reserve as well. Fortitude often having that quality of like stamina to it, and of the stamina of the long distance runner who doesn't use up too much force, meeting things with not necessarily an equal force, but the necessary force.
Yes, what is necessary.
Right.
The concepts of reserving for when you need it. It's like that. Was it Gattaca? I think in Gattaca, the notion of the the one brother who was weaker, who poses as a superbed human, and talking about the swimming, that he said, "How did you always beat me?" And he said, "I didn't save any strength. Like, I was exhausted by the time we got there, but I always won because I didn't reserve my strength, and you always saved enough to go back. So you never won because of that." And this notion of tricking ourselves into, because there is this concept metaphysically, in not always, but in many traditions, of more strength will come. But it's also through experience that you know how much strength might come, or you know that you can create the opportunity in which more strength might come. So sometimes this fear that we have of tapping all our strength out sometimes limits us from finding how much strength we actually have.
Right.
And in the pairing of the woman with the broken column and the lion on some of the cards where they're both there, you have too much force applied to something that supports you. And the lion, which represents raw physical strength. You have the concept of force itself, or like in Kiman, the forza, which is a parallel to ashe, which is the power to make things happen. And happen effectively is the thing. So may the medicine be effective, that you are trying to do just enough, what is necessary.
Yeah, because, and again, you're trying to hit that equilibrium between not too much and not enough, right? Because too much is going to spiral off and produce all sorts of other things that you have to deal with later. And
on the Rider-Waite card, she has a lemniscate above her head.
Yes, like the magician.
Infinite strength, perhaps, but no, you saw equilibrium. What does the lemniscate accept? This meditating around a certain point, so the unification of polarities back in the middle, so it's going from via to populace and back in and out. It's expansion, contraction. It is pairing off planets in opposites. It's Saturnine, Jupiter, expansion, contraction.
The strength of the raw first expression of the discs of the pentacles is again the juggler with that lemniscate with the coins, right? That the strength of Earth is in its changeability.
Forteza. Okay. All right. Okay. There. So, in looking at strength, I challenge you to link strength to Sagathana.
Okay.
Or what these concepts to Sagathana.
Sure. Well, okay, it's a good game.
You make my transitory sentence for me go.
It's flat pedagogy.
Yeah.
So you, let me see. Well,
I will remember this and use it in my dissertation.
Well, Sagathana is one of the deputies, right? It's one of the 6 under whom we have the 18, whether or not they're partitioned off for 3 apiece, or whether they're all under Sirac or Skirlin, depending on which reading you're doing, or indeed under a bunch of the others. And if so, do they parallel other unclean spirits? So the notion of the strength that coheres the others around them, which I think is a useful way of framing the deputies at points, especially if we have very little on them. And so one of the ways that I approach them is through what I, slightly pompously called the guilds of them. And so this notion not merely of like what are the powers listed of the deputies, which we do have, which we can go through Sagathana, but the idea of them being the coherence of what their subordinate spirits do. And in the case of Sagathana, that's Fukisie, who is one of the few subordinate of these unclean spirits in Verum that is expressly concerned with necromancy and has some very similar language in how Boon is depicted, this idea of swapping the living and the dead. There's some very like aerial, windy kind of analogies used, and the riches of the dead as well. Then you have Sergat, who opens locks and who has some lodestone-y mysteries as well as some invisibility mysteries. As well as also being potentially one of the spirits that's concerned with geomancy and one of these other guises. And then you have Guland as well, who's concerned with curing and causing disease. So we have a bunch of different kinds of protection work there as well, for want of another link. So this idea of the taming of the lion, the idea of the deputies as that which is cohered out of them, but also that which restrains not through opposition, but through a shared virtue.
It's you bring up a lot of little fun sparks. to go back to this concept of, well, one, because you said pompous, and then that made me think on that too, that what is the pomposity in this thing of oftentimes in, because I want to go back to the other specifics about Sagathana, but oftentimes we note that our personal mythologizing, our personal vocabularies, when we present them to other people and they don't agree with it, this can evoke one of two reactions. Usually online in Libre AF, it seems to promote the bravado and the anger that comes of like, well, I know what I'm talking about and I've done this for longer than you, and this idea of my mythology must be correct, because if it's not correct for you, then it must not actually be correct for me, as opposed to the meting out of strength, of knowing how much to apply, of does this actually challenge your worldview if someone disagrees with it, and how fragile is your worldview if someone else disagreeing with it truly makes all the cracks appear. And it's this constant meting out of what our strength is, because sometimes you want someone to disagree with you to show you, if you're in a debate, you want to know what the holes in your arguments are, and to find, oh, that doesn't make sense. And here I've been appealing to nostalgia and coherency and into something where it might not actually exist. And that is a form of pomposity, right? Of pretension, of being too, of decorating our columns in marble paint rather than making them of marble. That's a bad metaphor. But I think also the notions of these offices of the deputies, which for me, I'm thinking in Kimanda terms, right? And I do like, thank you for the English word deputies, but their support of the upper three, Lucifer, Beelzebub, Ashtaroth, or their equivalent Eshus in Kimbanda, that Sagathana or Veludo, Eshu Veludo, the Velvet Eshu, is under Eshu Beelzebub or Eshu Mor, and this, which is the equivalent, not saying he switches, because Troncohua, who is and it and Chidiri, who they switch places back and forth, and that is in the grimoires, right. As well as in Kimbanda, and I have a justification for that based on my understanding of what that framework is describing, as well as teachings of elders and things like that. However, Veludo and the velvetness of the tongue and the smooth talking of language, and here we're talking about defining something out of all possibility in Kimanda through Veludo. So you have the deputies of Lucifer, who are talking about articulation of that thought and rooting it and refreshing it so that it can be articulated by Veludo. So now you have this constant bonfire of things that is Eshumor, that is that thing, and Veludo is the first expression of this new meditation, but therefore is also not the final thought. And Veludo is associated with this smoothness of used car salesmen, the smoothness of the lie is defined by the truth and the truth is defined by the lie, that language itself is cliche and therefore not genuine. And anytime you speak, you are limiting the access to what you are trying to express. And this is the Buddhist notion of you can't define what God is. This limits it. And
so would that be flipped around and say that you can't define what the devil is?
Oh, for sure. Especially from a Buddhist concept, because God devil is the same thing. Right. That's some Red Feast Chudpa stuff. But that's interesting in the notion of strength, the supporting roles of deputies, of power that is meted out, that the deputies in some sense shield the lowers in command from the upper expressions, and that hierarchy sometimes serves a protection force and a meting out of strength. I'm really into this phrase meting today. I'm not quite sure why, but this dilution of power. No, that's not right.
Not quite a diffusion either.
Not really a diffusion. It's almost a definition, the same way that we appeal to Veludo to express, or to Marabo to express this and articulate this thought further, so that then we can go, no, you're not that idea, which is starting to go into the works of Troncohua and Jinidi, to have the expression of Veludo come out, that the little goat of hell, as we call him, does ba, and you can say, oops, you know what, not that one. And then we hear him ba over there, and that's still Veludo, and you go, yes, that one, get that one, that is the one for the job. And there are many people who are going to be like, what the hell are you talking about? But I find the kind of Kimbanda understanding of a lot of this organizational thing very helpful to processing it, at least within Kimbanda, and I'll get pompous about it and say someone says that's not Kimbanda, we're like, okay, that's fine, it's not your Kimbanda, which we have to deal with all the time.
Right.
That it doesn't upset my notions of it. This is constant thing in ATRs of there are some things that are landmarks for the whole tradition, and there are some things that this is how this house deals with it.
Right.
And that this spirit looks like this and this one down there, and they call that spirit by the same name over here, but it acts completely differently. But if both affect cure, if both are healing forces in Kimbanda, Kimbanda means the doctor, the medicine carrier, that the proof is in the pudding. And these mental explorations are a whole nother thing, which is one of the things in the West that modern occult revival, let's say, rather than the West, because I'm still a Westerner, even though I'm working in other paradigms, is sometimes we forget to look for the proof. And the proof becomes clarity of thought or clarity of articulation. But if that's what we've built our marble facade with, then it gives way to pomposity and ego fights and things like that. It's just, we had a mutual friend who just announced today that he was leaving all groups because and that's fine, because he'll comment just as strongly on a personal level anyway. But the notion of populace here, the confusion that can come from too many voices without a leader emerging, or too many voices that are all pretending they're individual leaders. What is necessary? Is this necessary right now that I defend my worldview with my life and my honor and my bride and my Facebook account? Or is it just, okay, that person thinks differently, I'm still going to go back to what got me the promotion or helped me heal my child or whatever it is, and go back like that. And part of this is we don't want to reinvent the wheel, that it's not about my way is the only way. You take what has come before and then you have to add to it. But sometimes, just don't add to it before you actually can add to it.
Learn your scales before jazzing around with them.
Yeah. There was with Jechi, I really respect Matt's way of phrasing things, and there's a whole bunch of influences that come in there, but someone wanted to teach songs to the group once, and he asked our director, Matt, when can I teach them? And Matt said, when you no longer desire to teach them, which is not just a restriction, it's actually the answer. That it's beneficial to the group when it's about the group, not about your desire to teach. That are you doing it for the group? And there is something interesting in the demonstration that you can learn once you have diverted your own populace of thoughts, once you've unified, which is like total Gurdjieff there, right? There's the multiple we, and we are trying all of our lives to refine it into an I, to use the singularity, because we are multiple bodies to start, and when we start to unify it, then the spiritual body is starting to form, and this is the permanence. The body of light is formed.
The move from populace to via or whatever else, you can form anything out of it.
The lemniscate, right? So it's
carving it out, right?
It's defining itself and doubling back on itself and learning from its past and going into its future, and through this via negativa as well as via positiva, that there is a new axis that is formed, and the earth may wobble, but it still revolves around that axis. Is interesting. Deputies, pomposity, strength, it's all there.
We get that lowest and highest thing with Sagathana as well. One of the lines that I think people have pondered on a lot is this, from where we do get the write-up of his offices itself in another grimoire, not in Verum, is
there are other grimoires?
Imagine is that they supposedly teach all the tricks and subtleties of the shepherds, and this capitalization of shepherds is particularly interesting, I think.
Especially with regards to populace, right?
Right.
So the flock, and like you need something to guide them.
The flock, the congregation, all of those notions. There's so many different ways that can be taken, and I think that's very interesting to ponder on.
It's interesting because Veludo, Mr. Velvet, is still sometimes quoted as being under Ashtaroth. And
well, this is the thing. Sagathana is by standard referred to as under Astaroth of the chiefs. in that Veramesque formula, despite the movement round of the others, the Gleorepts moving between Lucifer and Beelzebub, and whether or not you have Takimaki at all crops up in some places and not others, and in certain other parts of grimoires that have already been mentioned in that one, and those kinds of things, showing that it's a piecemeal palimpsest anyway.
Yeah, it's very interesting because the charts will show Veludo being distinctly under Moor, but because of the Sagathana being under Ashtaroth, there's this other relationship there, and I think also does this affect my cosmology? No, I can totally justify it there too, which is the beauty of overactive imagination, I suppose, and self-importance. But Veludo is connected to Islam, is connected to these mysteries, and before it turns into like this kind of spiritist thing of like there's spirits for every religion around. Understand that many Africans were Muslim when they came,
right.
And so the importance in a Congolese structure of understanding all spirits that are now on Brazilian soil, there have to be Muslim spirits, there have to be ethnic groups that show what it was, the diversity of Africa before the Middle Passage, and the diversity of Brazil because of the Middle Passage and because of Europe's colonization and the degradation of indigenous groups. But Veludo has an intense relationship. He's pretty stable. It's hard to know what he actually means. It's a little Oracle of Delphi type of thing of like, oh crap, that's what he meant, because of the tongue, the silver tongue, the velvet tongue. But he has an intense relationship with Reina da Colunga, the Queen of the Cemetery, who is very mature, powerful Bombagira. Some say the Bride of Omulu, the Lord of the Cemetery, the Lord of the Souls, the death itself. Not for me as a Kimbanda de Raiz practitioner, as for us as Kimbanda de Raiz practitioners, we don't mix the concept of the Orisha Omulu as being the same as Eshu Omulu. So I'm just putting that out there. But the idea that the Eshu Veludo, the one known as Eshu Veludo, actually spoke Swahili, which is a unifying tongue. It's an artificial tongue that seeks to unify. So disparate thoughts being unified into a common tongue, which fits into my own ideas about what the deputies are and the capeta. But that he delights in women with long hair. He is connected to Sufic dance and mysticism. There's just the sensuality of long hair itself is quite interesting. He wears a big blue velvet cape. It's not red velvet here. It's blue velvet. And turbans, curved knives, oxen. So it's there can be somewhere there we talk about the ox goad and things like that. It's just interesting. But that Veludo, first off, has like hundreds of puntos cantados and puntos riscados. The drawn points and the sung points are both a plenty for him, and that there are so many different qualidades, different aspects of Veludo. He's been around he's one of the older talked about Eshus, and Mr. Velvet, as we would call him, is quite quintessential, and is I don't know, there's something very interesting about this giving voice to a thought, that the thought and the language itself still contain the opposites that we talked about. There's a dualistic tension in that language that by what is not spoken or spoken,
or
there is
spoken
something
with
else
poetic
revealed.
ambiguity.
Yes.
Right.
And therefore the tension is even more preserved and somebody can get multiple meanings out of it. So Veludo is that gift of a spirit to speak, and they say something, and then 5 different people in the room hear the same phrase, but it means something intrinsically extremely personal to each of them. And so it's very hard for a person to consider what, especially since they don't know what's in the recesses of somebody's mind, little populace Ejioko stuff there, that the seed can be planted in multiple sources and bear fruit is a very Veludo thing. Yeah, I'm happy with that.
And kind of a quintessential notion of the deputies, the Malay, of being these besuited, charming devils who are also enacting a violence of taking things apart and putting them back together in new orders, right? The scissor of the tongue that scissors meaning.
And what animal has obviously a scissored into their tongue, is serpent, which is wisdom itself, the duality of the tongue, speaking both sides, the limits of the truth, the fruition of the lie, I suppose, to horribly bastardized Chumley there. And the confines of the truth, the limits of the lie. That's what I'm going for. Or maybe the other way around. Notes. Notes would be good, but we never know what we're actually going to talk about.
It's true.
Okay. I think we actually...
Did we hit everything there? I think we hit everything.
I think we actually hit everything in a very kind of nice flow. Thank you, Saint Agnes. This was... We have in the past sometimes picked topics that kind of easily flow between. This was perhaps one of the most random. We know that we can speak on Amber and Rosemary, and I'd picked a random thing, but I'm really happy with the way it all stitched together.
Yeah.
Here's to pomposity.
Here's to recognizing when we're calling ourselves pompous, and then seeing how that moves from a self-deprecation to an interesting and useful meditation.
Yeah. It's that whole, the notion that in order to truly grow, you have to fall apart every so often. And, the serpent shedding its skin, the tightness and even some concepts of cliff off. There. I brought that in. But I love the description of everything has clip off. Everything has its shell. It's the limits of the understanding or the luminosity of that there's a potential limit there. And that by thinking, meditating, identifying its essence, you're actually creating Klipa Noga, the brilliant, the shining Klipa. The shell becomes something different. It starts to extend and it creates a new extension of itself. It expands. And that here, to explore Klipa as the limits of our onion, the hard onion layer, as opposed to continuing to be able to pass and understand that we must hit the dot of every dot, as in the invisible sphirot, the dot of every concept in order to truly push beyond it. And it's interesting, right? It's the skin must feel tight and crack before the old skin can shed and the new skin grow. Which is horrifically unquieting and not comforting at all. Except that it's gonna, it gets better. Hashtag something. Not what that hashtag was intended for, but may your skin split and the world form a new one for you.
Right, may you outgrow your old limitations. May you always look back on your work and be slightly embarrassed by it, but also sympathetic to younger you.
Don't deify your old sheds.
Yeah, precisely. Yeah, if it's not...
Back in my day, our sheds were made of adamantine diamond dust. Okay. Well, on that note, I guess we can sign off and then start to go from there. Happy Feast of Saint Agnes.
Yeah.
May you fight for whatever it is your definition of yourself is, following Agnes's model. Throw chastity to the dogs if that's what you want, or preserve it.
May you find the purity of your actions.
Yeah. May your nudity make people blind and hairy. May
you have exactly as many swords as you would like put in your body.
Oh, wow. Okay. May you remember what you want to remember. May you get shocked when you want to be shocked. May you get shocked when you least expect it. There is the thing of that's how there's this notion too of we have to put ourselves in uncomfortable circumstances to challenge ourselves. Because if we don't, then the cataclysms of the universe, it's not that it's unnecessary feedback, but they will affect us deeper. So that if we haven't given ourselves shocks, I do a 36-hour paratheater workshop every January and have for a decade now with my theater group. And it's an extension of the work I did in college, but 36 hours is a really freaking long workshop to stay awake and just be nonverbal and only do certain things. And it's tedious and you learn about the relationship with yourself. But again, why do you do it? Because I've loved the discussions of this in the past, that you do it to jumpstart your year. We do it in the winter to provide a new trajectory, and you're dealing with the growth from one old skin into a new. In order to do that, you have to break it. And so you have to confront yourself with this discomfort, or I'm going to get honked at when crossing the street one day and have a panic attack and not know why. If I can control those little panic attacks by providing rocks to rub against, it's very different than someone stepping on me and making my world fall apart.
Encouraging your children to eat a little bit of dirt to get things under
so
their
that you
fingernails.
don't have allergies like I do, Mom.
Right. I think that's an interesting point when we're talking about both protection and purification. Is that if we overly bubble ourselves, if we allow those, if we allow that populace to become carca, if we cut off the fire,
super elastic bubble plastic. So, oh my gosh, it's the cylinder versus the bubble.
Yeah.
So
right.
Cylinder, it's still open on top and bottom.
Mm-hmm.
Down to the devil, up to God.
Right, where the heat and the light come and meet in the middle. Yeah, if that's an interesting notion for the soul needs dirt under its fingernails as well, so that it doesn't have too many allergies.
Wow, we're so pompous. Okay. But seriously, happy Feast of Saint Agnes. I hope this has been fruitful for our listeners that have stuck it out.
Yes.
And we will have this up, not by the first feast, because that was yesterday. Thank you. Again, check us out on Facebook, Radio Free Golgotha, on our website, www.radiofreegolgotha.com, with or without hyphens in between. And our Folk Necromancy Facebook group, totally searchable. You'll notice that we allow a lot of posts, and it's not just because we're being dicks, but we're trying to find a way to promote discussion as opposed to info mining, and to present topics. So we
tend to wait for someone to have a link to post rather than asking someone to post links for them. I
have a skull. What should I do with it? Not what I'm interested in discussing, and since it's our group, I can edit that out. But yeah, so there's close to 2,000 people in it, and there's some really great divergent voices from different traditions, and that's exactly what we're looking for. So come and poke holes in our arguments, please. Unification of thought is not the goal, except in bed, maybe. But yeah, so Facebook, which we call Living Liber AF sometimes, Folk Necromancy, and The Good Doctor does have a new book out through Revelor Press, which is a
available
chaplet
for
book
pre-order now. Yeah.
On the magic of the three magi, the magic of the magi, and the history of the cult, and some really wonderful pragmatic applications, inspired by history, inspired by traditional resources, as well as suggestions for understanding the cult as an aid and an inspiration for modern magicians. And I think you did a really nice job with it. So I'm excited to, maybe the challenge will be for him to bring up the magi, or the unchallenge will for him to not bring up the magi at least once per episode. But maybe we can do a little more on that sometime. Yeah. But Revelor Press has it. Please, we've posted links on Radio Free Golgotha as well. And it looks like it'll be a good for a few different publishing venues. And we hope to be speaking at a number of conferences again, so please do check out the talks and lectures section on the website, and like us on Facebook. Who knows what Facebook has in store for us this year, because they're supposedly shutting down the feeds for liked pages, so please do visit to find out more. That said, somebody is cooking and it smells amazing. So I'm going to shut myself up and let Al talk for the next hour, or we'll just start signing off.
Yeah, I think a sign-off is great. Wishing you infinite strength, dear listener.
Yes. Open that lion. Open it up nice and deep. All right. Thank you so much, and good night. Good luck. For the Father Nothing, put your hand inside the box.
Young human.
It's in the box.
Pain.
Yeah. All right. Bye-bye.